This video is the second in a series that I'm making about what I argue is a literary parallel that Plato included between his most famous dialogue, The Republic, and Euripides' tragic play, The Bacchae. As I discussed in the first video of this series, that subtext inverts the surface meaning of The Republic, and I'm arguing that Plato incorporated that literary parallel to transform his work of art into a literary model of the ultimate idea of the good, which is the archetype of wholeness through the union of opposites. Throughout the Republic, Plato depicts his mentor Socrates discussing the ideally just society with a group of young men. And the ultimate goal is to educate the ruling elite of this ideal society to open the eye of their soul to this idea of the good. And I'm arguing again that the literary parallel between the Republic and Euripides' tragic play, The Bacchae, serves as this literary model of the complementarity at the heart of the idea of the good, the source of all being. And that the subtext, the parallel with the Bacchae, indicates that the impersonal idea of the good, the spiritual sun, the infinitely brilliant source of all being, is simultaneously personified as the Orphic version of the god Dionysus. So there's a whole lot to chew on, and it's going to take a few videos to get to the bottom of the entire plan that I'm arguing Plato was using. But this video I created, and I'm just spontaneously making it because of a synchronicity that occurred, or a series of synchronicities that occurred, beginning back in the summer of 2006, when I first discovered this literary parallel while working as a campus cop at Georgetown University. So I'm not sure if I'm going to, at this point, put the title that I had in mind, but the title that I had in mind for this video was Trump's Bloody Ear, the Olympic Last Supper, Plato's Republic, and Euripides' tragic play, The Bacchae. So in the summer of 2006, I took a class at Georgetown University in tragic plays, and I read Euripides' The Bacchae. And when I did, I realized, oh, there seems to be some kind of a plot parallel with Plato's most famous dialogue, The Republic. And that became the thesis for my Master of Liberal Studies degree. I was working as a campus cop because if you work for a year at Georgetown University after that year, then they will pay for your tuition. So that was my plan. I started working in November of 2004. I remember my first day was when George W. Bush was reelected President of the United States. And my first mission as a campus cop at Georgetown University was the call that some students had turned the United States flag upside down in a distress call in front of the ICC building, Intercultural Community Building. So I walked up there in plain clothes because I just started. I was the first day on the clock with another officer. And we saw the young women who had done it. And we turned the flag right back up. Then we're leaving and walking away. And they came back out and turned it back upside down. Anyway, I mention that because the George W. Bush administration was aligned philosophically, at least in their foreign relations, with the so-called Straussian cabal, the disciples of the self-described Platonic political philosopher Leo Strauss. And at the time, there were a lot of articles written by left-leaning periodicals about the influence that this Straussian cabal had over the Bush administration. And I was fascinated with this idea, and I'd been reading Leo Strauss before the newspaper articles came out about the influence over the Bush and Cheney administration, because I thought, isn't this interesting? Plato and Nietzsche, these are Strauss's two favorite philosophers. Those are my two favorite philosophers, at least in the Western tradition. And they're having this tremendous influence over the United States foreign policy, and by implication also a lot of domestic policy. That is inherently interesting to me, also because I knew that Leo Strauss's interpretation of the esoteric hidden meaning of Plato's philosophy is the opposite of what I believe. So I accept Leo Strauss and his disciple Alan Bloom as teachers of mine who opened my eyes to the possibility that Plato was using esoteric, hidden literary techniques to convey a message between the lines, a secret message that he did not disclose to the general public. And so I'm grateful to them. I'm disinclined to criticize those two teachers of mine, but their disciples in the political sphere are perhaps responsible for getting us involved, the United States of America involved in wars in the Middle East, in Afghanistan and Iraq on false pretenses for over 20 years. So certainly a lot of people have accused them of that. I don't want to delve into the details of the politics. I want to try to focus on the fundamental questions of philosophy. But I bring it up because this entire series is based on my thesis, which was a response to Al Gore's book, Earth and the Balanced Ecology and the Human Spirit. And in another book, a subsequent book, Assault on Reason, Al Gore brings up he alludes to this Straussian cabal of neocons. Okay, so that was my first day on the force. And then in September of 2006, I got a call to a big party. There was a mob fight had broken out. And in the process of defending a student who had fallen and was being kicked and beaten, I received a blow to the head. And my head was opened up. I had a lot of stitches. My skull was exposed. There was blood all over the sidewalk. And it seemed to me then that bloody scene, for which I was given a commendation by the president of the university, whose name I forget, but it seemed to me that blood sacrifice was somehow related to my discovering this parallel between the Bacchae, which features the god Dionysus luring King Pentheus out to Mount Cithaeron, where he was ripped to shreds, beginning by the Maenads, who were led by his mother, Agave. I discussed that in the first video in the series. I went over the basic plot parallels, so I hope you refer back to that video to see what I'm talking about here. It just seemed to me that once you touch upon this ancient ritualistic pattern, that just knowledge of it requires some kind of a blood payment. And this is part of the Orphic religious movement, which was a secret religious society that existed openly in ancient Greece. So I'm arguing that Plato was to describe this ultimate archetype of wholeness through the union of opposites. He used literary artistic techniques, and one of them was to have this Orphic subtext paralleling the surface reading, which is more of a perhaps Apollinian leaning work of art, but even that Friedrich Nietzsche would argue against. But before I start branching off into all these other topics, I want to stay on the idea of a blood payment, which is part of the Orphic tradition. So Dionysus, according to the Orphic mythology, was lured out to play by the Titans upon the coaxing of the goddess Hera, the wife and sister of Zeus. So Zeus impregnated, in the Orphic version, Persephone. And she is the wife of Hades, the god of the underworld, who was abducted by Hades and raped. And she worked out a situation where she would spend part of the year with Hades, the rest of the year outside of the underworld. So according to this mythology, the Titans lured the baby Dionysus out to play with a mirror and other toys, which are alluded to in the Republic, and then they ripped him to shreds and ate him. And then enraged Zeus incinerated them with a lightning bolt. The human species was born from this, and we are mostly Titanic in nature, but we have a little bit of a Dionysian speck, which is our eternal reincarnating soul. And we have to fight the Titanic bodily desires in which we are imprisoned to liberate the soul from the cycle of reincarnation. All right, so that's the Orphic version of the myth of Dionysus. And in the Bacchae, Euripides is demonstrating the public version of the myth, where it was Semele, the mortal woman, who was Dionysus's mother. I discussed all that in the first video. But the idea of blood payment, we have this titanic sin. It's similar to the Christian concept of original sin. And to liberate ourselves from it, we must pay some kind of a blood payment. And we must reenact the ritual dismemberment and reintegration of the god. And so in 2006, in the summer, I discovered this literary parallel. And then I had this traumatic experience, which was very bloody, and it just seemed symbolically related. Okay, so now, then I did the thesis in 2008, April 30th. And subsequently, I've got another master's degree in political science from the University of Hawaii and a PhD in philosophy and religion. And I did my dissertation, also focused a lot on Plato's Republic and the idea of the good and holographic string theory. So, more recently, I decided, okay, I want to go back to this master's thesis and do a series of videos on this parallel between the Republic and the Bacchae. So the first step I thought would be to reread the Bacchae by Euripides. And I started to reread it, and in the middle of rereading it, former President Donald Trump was shot in the ear in Butler, Pennsylvania. That was July 13th, 2024. So immediately I saw the archetypal relationship here. The king, the president, shot in the ear. A lot of people consider Donald Trump a tyrant or a would-be tyrant, which is a big theme in the Republic and in the Bacchae. I'm not arguing Donald Trump is a tyrant. Others say Donald Trump was saved by Jesus Christ himself, and his head was turned at just the last second so that the bullet grazed his ear. Others say that there's a prophecy of the 8 heads of the beast in the apocalypse, and the 7th head is wounded and it comes back. It's miraculously cured and the people worship it. In this series, I'm not trying to take a side on the left or the right. My goal is to provide a framework for a national conversation, the goal of which is to achieve a state of wholeness through the union of opposites. And I am arguing that to place conversations like, for example, is Donald Trump a tyrant, to raise the national conversation out of the partisan bickering, which is tearing the nation apart, if we place this conversation in the context of this literary parallel between the Republic and the Bacchae, that, I believe, can elevate the nature of this bickering to something holy and good, regardless of which side you take. And that the basic themes that are being discussed at the national and international level, such as Donald Trump having his ear grazed by a bullet, an assassination attempt, if we place these conversations in this framework, I'm saying it can help us achieve a higher level of intellectual validity, and furthermore, it can help us find this union of opposites. All right, so the second part was the opening scene of the Olympics, which seemed to be reenacting Leonardo da Vinci's famous painting, The Last Supper, with Jesus in the middle and the apostles on either side of the table, of the banquet table. In the Olympics, Jesus was replaced by, it seems to be a woman, an obese woman. I'm not trying to make a moral judgment, but that this was what the artistic presentation to me seemed to be. And transgender women, I don't know if they were considered themselves transgender. I don't know if they considered themselves women, but it was men in women's clothes, or however you want to define it. This is the point. I'm not trying to take a side on, for example, was that blasphemous mockery, or was that a form of religious worship? I know that it was claimed by some that it wasn't even a representation of the Last Supper, it was a representation of the Feast of Dionysus. And then there was this blue character who was seemingly representing the god Dionysus, who obviously features predominantly in the Bacchae. But blue, why blue? It's another partial synchronicity here, or not partial. It just seems symbolically meaningful for what I'm trying to do in this series of videos. So Dionysus, the link between Dionysus and Christianity, that's a theme that we'll discuss in this series, but also blue. Why blue? There's no literary work that I know of that describes Dionysus as blue. There is, however, an entire work of literature that describes another divine character as blue, and that is Hinduism. Krishna, the flute-playing darling of the cowherd women, the gopis, is often depicted as being blue. He's described in the literature as bluish-black. Much darker in the Olympic ceremony, he was a lighter shade of blue. But in another series of videos, I discussed Friedrich Nietzsche's first book, The Birth of Tragedy, in which I argue he is alluding to the theory that was predominant in the field of philology at his time, that there was a link between Krishna and Christ. So there's a lot of literature about the parallels between Dionysus and Jesus Christ. There's also a lot of literature about the parallels between Krishna and Jesus Christ, and potential literary parallels, for example, between the tragic birth story of Krishna and the tragic birth story of Jesus, where an evil king tried to kill them as when they were divine children, they escaped, and subsequently the evil king slaughtered innocent children in the towns where they thought that these divine beings had been born. Okay, well, the reason I mention that is going back to Butler, Pennsylvania, where Trump was shot in the ear. That is similarly where the man who brought the Hare Krishna movement from India to the United States of America in 1965, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada, he's the founder of the International Society for Krishna Consciousness, he landed in Boston, and then his boat, the Jaladuta, went to New York, and he was picked up in New York. I believe this was September of 1965, September 17th, perhaps. I might be wrong on that one. At any rate, he was picked up by Mr. Argawal of Butler, Pennsylvania, who drove him back to Butler, Pennsylvania, where he lived, I don't know for how long, but what's interesting is while there, their 3-year-old daughter, Pamela Argawal, who was going to Sunday school. So Mr. Argawal was married to an American Christian woman, and they were sending their daughter to Sunday school. She was learning about Jesus. She sees Swami Prabhupada come in with his robes, and he's revered by her parents, and they call him Swamiji. So that you add the word G to the end is an honorific Swamiji. So the little girl thought they were calling him Swami Jesus, and she referred to him as Swami Jesus one day, and they all laughed. And he said, "And a little child shall lead them." And then he wrote her mother a letter on the little girl's 4th birthday. So as Pamela Argawal was the little girl, Sally Argawal was the mother. He wrote a letter to her thanking her for the good degree as Swami Jesus. He said, "Sometimes the Lord speaks through a little child, and I take this as Lord Jesus speaking through that child because I'm following in the footsteps of Lord Jesus." That's what Srila Prabhupada said. So Butler, Pennsylvania, the former president, the archetype of king, there's an attempted assassination, a blood payment. Is Trump a tyrant? Is he a champion of Christianity? I'm not taking a side on that here, and I don't have a very well-developed opinion about it. What I do want to do, again, as I've said before, is elevate the conversation about that into this framework of Plato's Republic and how it parallels the Bacchae. I think if, as Americans, we try that, if at least a small percentage of people on social media try to engage this conversation within this framework, that I believe it will have a tremendously powerful, miraculously curative effect. So these are the parallels. And then if you'll notice, another thing that inclined me to just make this video more or less spontaneously is that I woke up a couple of days ago with this burst blood vessel in my eye. So here, if I look over here, I think you can see it better. I don't know. I've never had that before. I've seen it, but more blood. So it's just this theme of, as I'm meditating on these parallels between the Bacchae, and I'm studying more and more deeply the Orphic religious tradition and the requirement for a blood payment, it just brings to mind that I'm tapping into some kind of an archetype that seems to be in tune with the zeitgeist, the spirit of the day. And this assassination attempt on Trump, the controversial Last Supper parallel with Da Vinci's The Last Supper, the allusions to Dionysus, the potential link between Dionysus and Christianity. All of these things just seem to be meaningful, archetypally correlated occurrences that I wanted to make a video on. Also, a video that talks about Trump's assassination attempt, the Last Supper, the Hare Krishnas, the Republican Bacchae. Just that kind of a title's bound to draw in more people than would otherwise look at an academic analysis of literary texts. So if you want to learn about the parallels that I was talking about in a general sense, I urge you to watch the first video where I go over the literary parallels. And also I invite you to tune back in as I continue to analyze this fascinating riddle that Plato included in his most famous dialogue, The Republic.